Hi, I'm not Bob Huntley. That's,
You're right.
yeah. He asked that that in the order of the presentations would make more sense if I would go first. And my role here, I was asked to come in and sort of like Dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, and present the budget picture and look at the numbers that have occurred over time. So that's the presentation that I have, and I don't think the cover page I have here with the train wreck needs any explanation. The first thing I would like to do is look at what the budget history and the allocation to the various entities in the state government. And you can see here is general fund revenue. These are actual numbers from 1994 through 2012 with the forecast. These forecasts here are the official state forecasts to get from DFM. And my last couple of slides, I will show you what is currently occurring, and that is for the second year in a row, the governor's office and the legislature have not accepted the economist forecast. They have cut it down lower. So that would be shown on some later slides. You can see that the major revenue sources are individual income tax and sales tax, reaching the top here in 2008 and then having a significant dip. Here is where we are now. This is the state economist forecast. Not surprisingly, the budget and the allocations, the appropriations follow. It's that same kind of a pattern, so the appropriations have followed what the revenue is coming in. And again, not surprisingly, the biggest piece of the budget is public schools with adult and juvenile corrections, another bigger piece. To put it in perspective, this particular graph here is exactly the same as this graph, only it's stacked up in bars so that you can see what the general fund revenue is. In 2009, the appropriations, you can see, peaked. If you take what general fund revenue appropriations were in 2009 and subtract 2011, you get a difference of $575 million. And that means that in general fund revenue terms, the appropriations over this period of 2009 to 2011, this 3-year period, is down by $575 million. And to, I guess, throw in balance here, both Representative Trail and Ringo talked about this being a shortfall. Those of us who, I guess, get a life, if you listen to KIDO in the morning, the Doug McConaughey show from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m., Saturday and Sunday mornings, that puts in perspective maybe where the station feels the audience is the heaviest. The interview was with Grover Norquist this morning, and Grover Norquist doesn't call this a deficit. He calls it a step toward right-sizing government. Okay? So it's a perspective kind of a thing. And if you look at what we hear the legislators saying, this is who I got, Bedke, Dean Cameron, and Tom Luna, they're talking about a new normal. So from their perspective, where we are now is setting a floor or a basis, and this is what we need to get used to in the future. This particular graph that I have here, I ripped off from Mike Ferguson, and this will lead a little bit of explanation. Not this last year, but the year before. when he was the state economist. He made a presentation to the Revenue Forecasting Committee, and he presented this particular concept. So let me explain it a little bit. The green line here, that's called trend history, and the forecast is with the dotted lines. This is taking currently 2010, fiscal year 2010, and saying what would general fund revenues be if all of those tax law changes that have occurred over the past since 1970, what would the revenues have been over that time? So it's sort of normalized or brought up to where we are today. So we're sort of, that's a fictitious line to a certain extent when you move back from fiscal 2010. But it is saying if the game was the same in the past as we're playing right now, this is what the revenues would have been. The red line here is the actual general fund revenues that have come in. So that when you have a period where the red line is above the green line, that means we're in a surplus period. When the red line is below, it means we're in a deficit period. And if you look at it, there was a lot of stability here up until about 2000, 2001. And those of us who have been here during that period remember this was when the state had these big surpluses, right? We had these huge surpluses. And the legislature acted as you would expect an Idaho legislature to act, and that is they cut taxes. The one thing that they did is they took the one-time money. Otherwise, if you have a surplus in a state budget, it's like, you've got a bucket over here and there's money in it. They cut taxes assuming that that bucket was going to continue on through time. Otherwise, rather than being one-time money, they treated a portion of it as if it was ongoing money. Well, they cut taxes, and we immediately had nothing like we have today, but we had a recession. So when you add those tax changes that occurred and you add them to the economic impact, then what happened immediately, the red line dives down below the green line. And then we had those periods when we needed to cut budgets, restrict funding. If I went back through the other graphs, you could see the same thing in those first two I presented. So then we had our boom periods, when we were building up surpluses. And we also had a whole series of fiscal actions during that period because we were in good times. And lo and behold, of course, everybody understands what happened is we have the economic impact is taking us down. So there's two things that have occurred here over time, primarily since the mid-1990s, and that is we've had economic cyclical changes, which have fluctuations in tax collections and therefore revenues. At the same time, we've had a lot of changes to the tax system, and I've got some graphs in a minute that will talk about that a little bit more. This is taking in essence, taking in essence what was on that last graph and plotting it in a cyclical sense. Otherwise, this sort of tries to take out of the general fund revenues what is being caused by the economy, and it is levelized to zero here, all right? So you can see back in the 70s, the same thing, we kind of had the stability. Here is where things were going well, and again, that matches that period in 2000 to 2001 when the state was building up significant surpluses. Then we cut taxes, and the economy drops down. So then, of course, we're in this deficit period. Then we have the boom period, and now we're moving into the period that we have right now. So this is what the shortfall, the numbers, is a back of the envelope kind of estimate of what is being caused by the economic fluctuations. And this little blip right here, you will notice, if you look at the state economist forecast, it's Derek Santos now, this is a smooth valley here. Otherwise it goes down and back up. You notice this dip here where it's 467 million. That is where the state economists forecast growth of 6.9% for this coming fiscal year. The governor and I think officially the JFAC, some legislative committee said, let's only grow at 3%, not the 6.9%. So the dip is caused because the last fiscal year actually grew at 4.2%. So the budgeting that is coming down, that has been set, the mark that was been set that was reported in the papers yesterday, is actually forecasted a lower growth rate than what actually occurred through fiscal 2010, which is basically saying, and of course it's to be cautious and all of those kinds of things, but it is saying that the economy isn't getting better. They're expecting maybe the economy, in fact, will get worse, and that is the new normal, is where that particular base period is. Economists like to look at tax policy and revenue and those kinds of things on sort of a measure of what can we afford, otherwise what's the income to the state. It could be gross domestic product. These last two slides that I have are based on personal income. And this first one is the general fund revenue as a share of personal income. And this normalized revenue, again, this is borrowing Mike Ferguson's approach where the general fund revenues here in the earlier years are based on what are the taxes that we have now. Otherwise, if you looked at these numbers, they would differ from the actual general fund revenue, but it's going back in time, so we're looking at apples and apples. And you can see that in the 70s, up to 7% general fund revenue personal income. It flattened out in about 6% through 2000. It was up a little. Then we had that dip, which was that earlier recession. And then we move into the time period now, and the lighter bars here are the forecast of the state economists, but adjusted for this 2012 number where that his bar, the state economist bar, would be higher than the other bars. And you can see that over time here since 2000, the affordability or the amount of the general fund revenue is less than as a percent of personal income. If you look at sales tax, you get the same kind of a pattern. And again, the sales tax has been adjusted back through time. It's normalized, and you can see that we have a slide here where the sales tax, the general fund revenue as a percent of sales tax is going down, again caused by two things. One is of course the cyclical and economic changes. This little blip here is driven mostly by the construction boom, all the sales tax paid on construction, and also the fact that since sales tax had been implemented, we have had a series of exemptions, and so it's a two-pronged item. That one is a cyclical impact is causing it, and also a changes in tax law is changing it. So depending on your perspective, Again, if you're Grover Norquist, it is a step toward reducing government, or we have a deficit. If we go back in time, if one assumes right here in 2009 that is where our base should be, was government too fat? Or after those of us who have lived here, after the previous 20 years, Idaho is famous for being tight-fisted. It is famous for, we got to cut budgets. We have been cutting the fat out of government for at least the last 15 years I can remember that we've been here. So it's your perspective then on where we are. If you assume that in fiscal 2009 we were about as lean as you could get, then we're looking at maybe $700 million shortfall or deficit. And of course, there are others in the legislature who have a different perspective and want to build a base for future revenues at the bottom of the trough of the worst recession that we've had since the 1930s. Question now, or ta-da? There's a lot of numbers, but being an economics professor, I'm used to having do numbers and seeing people's eyes glaze. But I hope I put it in perspective for you.
I think we'll hear from
Bob and Nannis.